For most of the last 200 years, if you opened a history textbook anywhere in the Western world, Africa's story before European contact was told in one paragraph, sometimes one sentence. Empires that ruled for centuries, trade networks spanning oceans, universities older than most of Europe's, all of it compressed into a footnote or left out entirely. This isn't because that history didn't exist. It's because someone made a decision again and again to leave it out. This is the story of what got erased and why. Start with what we actually know happened. By the time European ships began reaching sub-Saharan Africa in serious numbers, the continent was home to empires that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. Mali, under Mansa Musa in the 14th century, was so wealthy that when he passed through Cairo on his pilgrimage to Mecca, he reportedly gave away so much gold that it disrupted the region's economy for over a decade. Songhai controlled trade routes across the Sahara. Great Zimbabwe built stone architecture without mortar that still stands today. Benin's craftsmen cast bronzes so refined that European visitors, centuries later, assumed they had to be evidence of some ancient European or Middle Eastern influence because they refused to believe African hands alone could have made them. Timbuktu, often invoked today as a byword for the middle of nowhere, was in fact one of the intellectual capitals of the medieval world, home to a university and library system holding hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, law, medicine, and philosophy, some of which still survive today, painstakingly preserved by local families who hid them from later conflicts. None of this is fringe history. It's documented, it's verifiable, and much of it was even acknowledged by early European travelers and scholars who visited these places directly. So the question isn't whether this history existed, it's what happened to the telling of it. The erasure wasn't a single event. It was a slow, compounding process that unfolded across roughly 2 centuries through several overlapping mechanisms. The first was justification. As the transatlantic slave trade expanded, and later as European powers began carving up the African continent during colonization, there was a growing need for an intellectual framework that made both of those systems seem morally acceptable. If African societies were framed as primitive, without real history, government, or achievement, then colonization could be repackaged as a civilizing mission rather than a conquest for resources and labor. This wasn't a fringe idea. It was argued seriously by prominent European philosophers and academics of the era, some of whom explicitly wrote that Africa existed outside of history altogether, a claim made not out of ignorance, but as a convenient justification for what was already happening. The second mechanism was academic gatekeeping. As formal history became an academic discipline in European universities through the 19th century, a hierarchy of evidence was established that happened to favor European traditions. Written documents were treated as the only legitimate historical source, while oral tradition, the primary method through which most African societies preserved their history, was dismissed as folklore or myth rather than valid historical record. This meant that even well-documented oral histories, passed down with extraordinary precision through trained griots and court historians across generations, were excluded from what counted as real history, simply because of the medium they were recorded in. The third mechanism was more direct. destruction, and looting. The 1897 Benin Punishment Expedition didn't just loot the Kingdom of Benin's royal palace, it burned it, destroying an unknown quantity of physical historical record, along with the thousands of artifacts that were shipped to European museums and private collections. Similar patterns played out across the continent, as colonial administrations seized, destroyed, or deliberately suppressed local records and institutions that complicated the narrative of an unstructured, historyless Africa waiting to be organized by European rule. By the 20th century, this erasure had become institutionalized in education itself. Colonial school systems, and later, even many post-independence education systems, still operating on colonial-era curricula, taught African history as beginning with European contact. Pre-colonial Africa, when covered at all, was often reduced to vague references to tribes and kingdoms without the same specificity, dates, or narrative depth given to European history in the same textbooks. This had a compounding effect across generations. Students, including African students, absorbed a framework in which their own pre-colonial history felt thin, undocumented, and secondary. Not because it was, but because the material available to them had been shaped by over a century of deliberate minimization. Since the mid-20th century, this has been slowly correcting. African historians, archaeologists, and researchers, alongside a growing number of international scholars, have spent decades rebuilding a more accurate picture using archaeology, radiocarbon dating, oral history methodology, and re-examination of colonial-era records against the grain of how they were originally framed, but the correction faces real obstacles. Many of the physical artifacts needed to tell this history in full detail still sit in European museums, tied up in ongoing repatriation disputes that move slowly and often incompletely. Research funding for African archaeology remains a fraction of what's available for more heavily studied ancient regions. And popular culture, textbooks, and even casual public knowledge still lag significantly behind what academic research has already established. This matters beyond academic accuracy. The idea that Africa lacked complex history, governance, and achievement before European contact wasn't just wrong. It was foundational to how colonization, exploitation, and centuries of global inequality were justified and sustained. Correcting the record isn't simply about giving credit where it's due. It's about understanding that the erasure itself was never incidental. It was a tool used deliberately, and its effects are still being felt in what gets taught, what gets funded, and what gets believed, generations after the systems that created it officially ended. The empires were real, the universities were real, the trade networks, the metallurgy, the architecture, all of it happened, and much of it is still standing, still buried, or still sitting in the reserve rooms of museums thousands of miles from where it was made. What was erased wasn't the history itself, it was the telling of it, and that telling is still being fought for, one excavation, one repatriated artifact, and one corrected textbook at a time.